Hi everyone, nice to see you again. I hope you're well, and welcome to the final lecture in our section on the establishment of Northern Ireland. We're going to have, another section later on which is going to deal with the period 1922, but this is the initial period we're talking about. And I mentioned last time this issue of violence and how violence arrives in the north, which begins in this summer of 1920. And we get the dreadful shipyard expulsions, and then this awful kind of pattern of reprisal. And I say the perception, certainly from, I think, both the Unionist government and from the population at large, is that the state is under siege. Now, the reality, of course, isn't like that at all. We've mentioned the IRA in the north is not particularly strong, and it only tends to be strong when it gets help from the south or the southern initiatives or whatever, or southern support with weapons and money and so on. So the threat isn't really a real threat. But of course, what matters in history in terms of driving historical action is not the reality. It is the perception. And there's definitely this sort of pervasive fear that you have in this new Northern Ireland. And what that leads to is kind of what's happened back during the Ulster crisis, which is in isolated communities along the border, so small Protestant enclaves along the border, maybe in sort of North Monaghan or South Armagh, around Newry and so on, Fermanagh, you get men coming out drilling. So like the UVF had started that way, if you remember, people coming out, building their own militia forces, self-defense forces, local patrols, because the IRA are just over the border waiting to pounce. They're not really, although there's enough activity, as we say, close by with a barracks being burned or something like that, to make that fear at least kind of credible. And like had happened during the Ulster crisis, the Northern Irish government now tries to, as it were, take control of that growing sense of fear and militancy. If you remember, it had done that in terms of forming the UVF. And what it does now is it approaches the government, the British government now, to ask for the creation of its own auxiliary police force. So remember, we're at a position now, we haven't had the elections yet. The elections aren't until May 1921, so there is the Northern State isn't officially up and running. Only then will you have ministers, and then you'll have budgets and so on. Everything's going to be arranged, and then maybe you can start building your own police force. That's going to take time. But the fear is now what's going to happen in this interregnum between those, and we need our own police force. The RIC, of course, are the police force of all of Ireland at this time. But in the north, they're viewed increasingly with suspicion. I mean, at best, maybe passive. And at worst, colluding with the IRA at the local level. That's the fear. And the Ministry of Home Affairs files in Northern Ireland are filled with these sort of rumours and stories that there's a local police officer who's not to be trusted, and we've heard he's copying letters that are arriving, in the post office and sending them on to IRA headquarters. I mean, it's all just this kind of paranoia that you get. And it's certainly true to some extent that the composition of the RIC in Ulster had changed during the War of Independence and was continuing to change. And I mentioned this before, if you remember, where you have older Catholic officers in the south, in the trouble spots down in Munster and so on, who are transferred to the north and replaced by younger, fitter, I say maybe more loyal, again, if you want to think about it that way, officers, RIC officers in the south. So there's a sense, as I say, in which they're getting sort of the second-rate southern RIC officers in the north, and they particularly can't be trusted because they're not from Ulster. Therefore, they're far more Catholic and so on. And if you look at, and I'll just show you two key figures in all of this. Of course, here is James Craig himself, and particularly this man on the right, Richard Dawson Bates. Now, Richard Dawson Bates is Minister of Home Affairs, as you can see, a long, long time. The Ministry of Home Affairs in Northern Ireland is huge. It is, this is almost like a kind of police a force with a state attached. This is where all the money goes, and this has tremendous power. And this is a man, Richard Dawson Bates, who is, whose paranoia knows no bounds. He even voices concerns about the loyalty of the British Under Secretary, a man called James McMahon, who's in Dublin Castle, because he's a Catholic, therefore he can't be trusted. Remarkable kind of paranoia. And he certainly is one person that sees the RIC in the north as increasingly Catholic and therefore increasingly disloyal. There's no real evidence for this, but that is the perception. So calls now, as it were, from the grassroots as well, that we need a loyal, locally recruited police force now. And this will lead eventually, and it happens quite quickly, this. I mean, as early as July 1920, so when the shipyard expulsions are going on, this first awful outbreak, Churchill himself approaches the cabinet and he asks the cabinet this question: what would happen if the Protestants in the 6 counties were given weapons and charged with maintaining law and order and policing the country? What do you think's going to happen? What a stupid question that is. Partisan, partial policing of the majority over the minority. So he asked this question. And over time, over the next few months, what's going to emerge, of course, is this: the Ulster Special Constabulary. This new force, so established, as you can see, in October 1920, and this will grow and grow and grow, this force. It will eventually, by June 1922, have something like 35,000 members. Amazing size for such a small country, but absolutely huge. Now, just to show, it has a number of classes in it, and I just want to spell out the differences between these various classes. The first group we have, of course, are the A Specials. Now, who are the A Specials? Well, A Specials are full-time and paid. They work alongside regular RIC men. They're not allowed to be posted outside of their home areas. So regular RIC men can be posted anywhere in the country, as we've seen, back and forth. And there's about 5,000 of these. And the idea really of the A Specials is they are, uniformed, professional police auxiliaries who will eventually go on to become the new police force of Northern Ireland. So they're almost in training, as it were. And of course, the new police force of Northern Ireland is going to be the RUC, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, which is going to eventually be established in June 1922. So again, you see, that's the point. You have to have the elections first and then get everything in line and eventually have your own police force. And that's the idea, that these are going to be, as I say, going to slot into that kind of role. Now, so the RUC itself will have no role in this conflict, in this violence at all. It will all be over, essentially, by the time they actually come on stream in June and July 1922. So, I say that's what the A Specials are. At the other end of the scale, we have what we call C and C1 Specials. Now, these are, again, these are unpaid. They're not uniformed. Usually these are older men. If they used at all, they use for things like static guard duties and so on. And essentially the idea of the C Specials is a reserve now. And only to be called out in case of some dire emergency. So, I mean, essentially it's every able-bodied Protestant man in Ulster, who can stand up straight is going to be part of this. Huge force this would be, tens of thousands of them. But in case something happens, I don't know, there's an invasion or something from the south or whatever it might be, the state's on its knees and you need to call these men out. They never will get called out. Only on occasion, some of them will be, maybe to guard a checkpoint here and there. But so they're not going to be really a key factor in all of this. The key group, of course, is going to be the middle group, which are the B Specials. Now, the B Specials will become, of course, the most notorious arm of this new auxiliary police force. The B Specials are, well, they're part-time. And usually you'd go on duty, I don't know, one evening a week maybe. So you're working, you're doing your job, and then you go out like a kind of home guard sort of situation. If you're British, you'll understand what I mean by that. I don't know if you have in the States, a kind of National Guard situation where you're kind of you're working, but you go on duty kind of occasionally. They're not paid, but they do have a generous system of allowances. So you do get your expenses and things like that. And they basically serve wherever the RIC serve, and they man mobile groups sort of in platoon size. And this is quite a big group. It originally has something like 19,000 members of the B Specials. The most worrying thing about them is, I say, one thing, they have their own command structure, which is separate, therefore, from the police. So they kind of work in a strange shadow relationship with the police, but they have their own command. And I suppose the biggest problem as well is they're allowed to keep their own weapons at home. So they're issued weapons and you keep them under the bed and pull it out and whatever, put your armband on and off you go with your mates in the local area and patrol about and so on. Almost as soon as they're formed, the B Specials, they become implicated in a whole range of unsavoury incidents. And so rather like the Black and Tans in that sense. And, you know, this decision it's a very stupid decision. I think whatever way you look at this, you can understand why they're doing it, but the idea of actually creating a police force out of one, in this case, the majority Protestant community within this state will be absolutely deadly. I mean, literally deadly. And at the time, many people in the British establishment are criticising this. I'll give you an example. Here's a quote from Sir John Anderson, and he's the Under Secretary at Dublin Castle, so he's the top civil servant. And you can see this. You cannot, in the middle of a faction fight, recognising one of the contending parties and expect it to deal with disorder in the spirit of impartiality and fairness, essential in those who have to carry out the order of the government. You cannot do this. It's never going to work. Now, Catholics are officially allowed, Northern Catholics are allowed to join this force, but few of them do, as you'd expect, and few of them are actively encouraged to do so. So there's no quota system, as it were, with this. There's no proportional system in terms of the B Specials or whatever. And I say Catholics themselves, Northern Catholics, right throughout the long existence of the B Specials, view them as just a dreadful kind of symbol of the partiality and the sort of, the almost terroristic, discriminatory nature of the Northern state. Here's a quote from one nationalist at the time who says, we see the Specials as being nothing more, nothing less than the dregs of the Orange Lodges, armed and equipped to overawe nationalists and Catholics, and with an inclination to invent crimes against nationalists and Catholics. And that's kind of true. And you think about the Orange Order, we think about the GAA, if you remember, we talked about the volunteers and the IRA and so on, being a kind of framework, as it were, for the local IRA companies and so on, and battalions to be formed often around the football team or the hurling team or something. Same kind of thing happens with the Specials when it comes to Orange Lodges. So, the guy who's kind of a butcher, during the day, goes home, I'm on patrol tonight, gets his weapon from under the bed or whatever, and off he goes to the lodge. Often they'll meet in the lodge with all his other mates from the lodge and then go on patrol, kicking indoors and on all the kind of dreadful kind of, abuse and so on, which we've seen particularly in the South. So it's a terrible, terrible idea. Here are some B Specials. You'll see later the B Specials get uniforms. So they start off with just with armbands and stuff, but then they get uniforms and, as I say, become much more a key part now of the Northern security apparatus. And they will always be deeply unpopular with Northern Catholics. For the rest of their long, long existence. I mean, the B Specials don't come to an end now for 50 years. I mean, not until, I think, March 1970, finally, is when they're disbanded and gotten rid of. And just the existence of the Ulster Special Constabulary, so, as I say, such a huge force, which is really unnecessary considering the actual reality of the threat. Remember the nature of the violence here in the North. There's lots of it. There's lots of violence and people being killed and so on, but much of it is fired by this tit-for-tat reactive violence. You know, say there's a shooting somewhere down, whatever, in Newry or something, it hits the press in Belfast and it explodes. That's where a lot of the violence comes from. The reality is, so it's the perception, I say, that's driving this kind of paranoid obsession that you have throughout the whole history, really, of the Northern State with security and the largely non-existent threat from the IRA. And as you can see here, I think, you know, just to highlight this idea really of Northern Ireland now remaining in a permanent state of emergency going forward. And this is shown no better than when you look at what happens well, it's brought in April 1922, which is the Special Powers Act, the Civil Authority Special Powers Act. And these are meant to be emergency powers in 1922 amidst the chaos to keep the state in control and to hold back, you know, the forces of anarchy. And you bring in now these powers which allow the police essentially to arrest anyone without trial. So internment is introduced. You can just whip you off the street or out your bed and you're thrown in prison. It allows for the death penalty. It allows for flogging, all kinds of things. It even allows for the exclusion of people from Northern Ireland. You can be gotten rid of, you're not allowed back into Northern Ireland. And again, this Special Powers Act is meant to be just a short-term emergency measure during what are admittedly very dark days in the spring and early summer of 1922. But of course, that eventually becomes permanent. So every year they end up renewing it and renewing it and renewing it, even when the threat of the IRA and this whole period of revolution is over. And then it becomes permanent. And that itself is not repealed until 1973. So this is a state that's constantly on the defence. And I say this perception that the state is under siege. Now, when we move on to our section, our second section on Northern Ireland, and we talk about the period 1922, which is such a pivotal period, you can argue that for a few months, as I say, running from the spring of 1922 until June, so not long, a few months, but Northern Ireland really does face a genuine threat to its existence, a concerted political, diplomatic, military threat now, and a genuine attempt to bring it down. And now again, a lot of this has to do with the South. Remember, as we said, the Northern IRA and so on, Northern Republicans are not that powerful, but when they get Southern support, they become dangerous. And it's in that period in 1922 where you're going to have, particularly Michael Collins, the first and I suppose only Southern politician who's going to prioritise the North now and try and do something about it. And we'll talk about his attempts in the midst of this growing division over the Anglo-Irish Treaty, where he will attempt now through supporting Northern units, to using his own IRA units and supplying weapons and putting pressure on diplomatically on Churchill and on James Craig, all in an attempt to undermine the partition settlement. So you could argue certainly maybe then the state is kind of under threat. But no, as I say, even when the threat is and the siege is lifted, as it were, the paranoia remains. So I say this is a state which is traumatized, as it were, from its birth and never really gets over it through its whole kind of long existence. But I say that's going to be future. We'll talk about these cataclysmic kind of events in 1922. But what I want to do in the next section is go back now to talk about the end of the War of Independence, because I want to try and keep things in at least a rough kind of chronological kind of shape. And we'll talk about, of course, remember, we got to the point where the Northern Irish Parliament's established, and then we said the King makes this speech, and then 2 weeks later, a truce is now going to be agreed, bringing the War of Independence to an end. And we'll talk about that truce period. We'll talk about the negotiations, which will eventually lead to a settlement with Southern nationalists in the shape of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. The reaction to that treaty, which is not going to be good for many people, which is going to lead to the first time now the division of this Sinn Féin IRA movement in the first 6 months of 1922. into two opposing blocks. Should we accept the treaty or against the treaty, which is eventually going to lead to civil war at the end of June 1922. So that will be our next section. And then I say we will then move back and talk about the North, and I say this very, very dangerous period for a few months in 1922, and it looks as if the northern state itself could certainly collapse. Okay, everyone. So I'll see you all next time. Take care.